afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session on Zero Hunger, part of the World Humanitarian Forum. We have about 35 minutes today to discuss this very challenging issue against the backdrop of food insecurity, given the impacts of COVID-19, climate change, and increasing global populations. The idea of radical change seems paramount in making progress toward reducing hunger. Today, we have a very distinguished panel to discuss some of the issues around reducing food insecurity, and I expect a robust exchange of ideas. I'm going to quickly introduce our panelists, and then we'll jump right into the discussion. So today we have with us Mr. Lawrence Haddad, the Executive Director of the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, Mr. Andrew Rzepa, a partner at Gallup, Ms. Valerie Guarnieri, the Assistant Executive Director of the World Food Program, Mr. Martin van Wieko, the Global Director for the Agriculture and Food Global Practice, World Bank's Sustainable Development Practice Group, and Donald Brown, the Associate Vice President, Program Management Department at the International Fund for Agricultural Development. I'm Laura Powers. I'm with the New Climate and Humanitarian Crisis Initiative, and I'm delighted to moderate this session. So, thanks to all of you for your time and participation today. The panelists here have indicated a strong interest in examining some of these issues in light of the current COVID-19 pandemic. So with this in mind, I'd like to address the first question today to Ms. Guarnieri. COVID-19 is deepening the hunger crisis in the world's hunger hotspots, and it's creating new epicenters of hunger across the globe. By the end of the year, a shocking 12,000 people per day could die from hunger linked to COVID-19. Potentially more than will die from the disease itself. Can you talk a little bit about your views on how COVID-19 is fueling hunger in an already hungry world?
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today on this important issue. We saw for decades that we were able to put hunger on the run. And in the past few years, we've seen the numbers of hungry people grow as a result of conflict, of climate. And now we're seeing that impact deepen further with COVID-19. And we're seeing hunger deepen. We now anticipate, we had projected that there would be 135 million acutely hungry people this year. And with COVID, we're seeing that number increase by 80%. So 270 million acutely food insecure. And the hunger is growing in two ways. On the one hand, because of the global recession, weaker currencies, higher interest costs, inflation, lowering remittances, we're seeing populations who are now unable to access and afford enough food in the markets for themselves and their families to survive and to thrive. And then at the same time, because of some of the global supply chain issues that have also been affected by COVID, we're seeing the supply of food in the markets reduced and prices as a result of that go higher. And we saw that in 10 countries, in 20 countries, we saw a 10% increase in basic food prices in recent months. And so people are getting able to afford less and able to actually buy less because of these two issues. So that's having a major impact. As always, the impact is greatest on the most vulnerable, and we're seeing people who are employed in the informal sector, lower skilled jobs, urban populations, displaced and people and refugees, and then among these populations, women who are most severely affected by these issues. So as we look to the response, we really need to ensure that we are making sure that food systems deliver for those most vulnerable in the most fragile context.
Thank you for that. Mr. Haddad, would you like to add anything to that?
Thank you, Laura. So again, we focus a lot on hunger. We also focus on undernutrition. And I just wanted to share with the audience some of the recent estimates from some work we did together with a consortium of others called Standing Together for Nutrition. This work was published in The Lancet about 2-3 weeks ago. And when you look at kids under the age of 5 who are wasted, these are kids who are really thin, skin and bone, and they're the most vulnerable when it comes to premature mortality. The estimates we saw were for the number of wasted kids going from 47 million currently to 55 million. That's just in a 6-month period. And the estimate there was based on a GNI decline in India, very largely, of 10%. And I just found out yesterday the latest estimates for GNI, gross national income decline in India, are not 10%, they're 15%. So I'm really deeply worried that the impacts on hunger that we see that Valerie so brilliantly described, they're going to be felt really strongly for the very youngest. And the really worrying thing is not only are those kids more vulnerable to mortality, if we don't do anything about reversing those declines in the next 18 months, those impacts are going to be the terrible legacy of this crisis, and they will cascade down the generations. Over.
Mr. Van Wiekel, from an agriculture point of view, and from your perspective at the World Bank, how are you seeing these astonishing statistics and numbers that have been presented today?
Thanks very much, Laura. And, the statistics are indeed astonishing now. I mean, if you think about it, of course, I mean, the SDG2 on hunger was already off track, I mean, before COVID-19 hit. And we clearly see and we heard that COVID-19 is accelerating this. But what we see is actually rising food insecurity in a world of plenty. Because if you look at global stocks of food grains, I mean, they're at very comfortable levels. And also what you see is rising food insecurity going hand in hand with rising food loss and waste. I mean, already before COVID-19, about 1/3 of agriculture production was lost or wasted. And because of the disruptions in food supply chains that we see, I mean, that figure, is even higher. The cost estimates, I mean, to reach zero hunger, I mean, vary considerably. But I think the highest estimate, I think, put forward by the FAO, I mean, states that it costs about $250 billion, I mean, to reach zero hunger. This is of course a big number, but actually it's a very modest number if you compare it to the public support that countries across the world actually are providing to agriculture, which is over $500 billion a year. And of course, $250 billion is 0.3% of the world's, global GDP, which is estimated about $86 to $87 trillion. So actually, the problem is enormous, but the resources that are needed to resolve it actually should be there and actually are relatively modest. And I think that's an important reflection point, I think. The World Bank is monitoring the effects of COVID-19 very closely. I mean, we're coming up with a regular update, I mean, every week that is sent around, I mean, to external parties as well as to internally to bank senior management. I mean, we see 3 major transmission channels, income losses because people are losing their jobs and because of COVID-19 lockdowns. The disruptions in the food supply chains, it's difficult to transport, to mobilize labor. And also some countries, I mean, where we see severe depreciation of local currencies that is pushing up, I mean, food prices in local currencies. Right now, we think that the problem is mainly on the demand side. But I mean, if this continues and if critical segments of the supply chain. Think about SMEs who play an important role in input markets and keeping output markets going. It might actually complicate farmers' access to fertilizers and inputs that then down the road, I mean, could also kind of change this demand problem also into a supply problem. And it's something we are actually looking into very closely. Back to you, Laura.
Thanks for that. I would like to ask Mr. Brown if he has any additional comments, particularly given some of those interesting statistics that you just provided for us on the economic impact of this.
Thank you, and good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, depending where you are, to everybody. So yeah, I think, you know, 2 or 3 points. I mean, firstly, and I'm building on what Martin just said, you know, some of this is about the economic impacts, the loss of money in people's pockets. But, you know, we've seen in a lot of countries that it's also, as Martin says, about the demand side, about the supply side, about the movement of food. You know, quite a bit of what we're seeing is that people do have money to buy food, but it's often not always available. Local markets are breaking down because of movement restrictions. Small producers are not able to warehouse the food or store it if it's not being picked up immediately. And you know, and so actually the government response to a health crisis can also cause a food crisis here. So we've seen that breaking down supply chains, food systems breaking down in countries, but we've also got some good examples where governments have ensured that they continue to work. So for example, in Rwanda, which had a very restrictive lockdown, you know, government ensured the transport of food did move around the country, that personnel linked to food supply systems were able to move, and that, you know, essential inputs were allowed to move. And, you know, we're talking a bit about the here and now, but I'm as worried about moving into the future. As Martin says, the stocks are there, but we already know in many countries in Africa, for example, they're not able to get the seed, that they either don't have the money or they don't get access to the inputs for the planting seasons. You know, in northern Ghana, in a lot of the belt there, the planting season is on us and they don't have the supplies. Governments are doing a really good job at trying to respond to a health crisis, but part of that is by diverting resources away from agriculture and other areas. So, you know, I really worry that we're not going to accentuate the issue by creating a sort of a food crisis, a looming one, by not getting the seeds and the crops in the ground now. And I suppose my last point is really, you know, we also need to remember that much of this food is produced by small holders the world over, who have very, very little resilience and coping mechanisms to the sort of shocks that COVID is bringing in. So we've already got a food crisis and problems where families can't afford food. But actually, if we don't look after the small producers in this, I think we're going to end up with an even bigger food crisis going forward, particularly as they produce so much of the food and yet they are not able to bridge the sort of gap here and without significant external help, and we just won't have crops, you know, at the next harvest if we're not careful.
Mr. Rzepa, your perspective here would be very enlightening as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much for the invitation to be here today. So we heard that we weren't on track to hit SDG 2 even prior to the pandemic, but just in terms of the magnitude of us being off track is, so since 2014, year on year, until 2019, we've stepped further away from achieving that zero hunger goal year on year. One of my major concerns about the pandemic is the fact that ultimately we're seeing it further highlighting those flaws in inequality in the system that pre-existed. So in 2019, 2 billion people across the world did not have access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food. So that's prior to the pandemic. Approximately 1 in 10 individuals across the world were severely food insecure. Within that 2 billion, there were huge inequalities that we saw. We saw that women were more food insecure than men, with that gap actually increasing between 2018 and 2019. So even when women have the same income, education, and they still have higher levels of food insecurity. So even controlling for socioeconomic characteristics, women had a 27% chance of being severely food insecure at a global level. When you think about that global gender gap, and you look at the characteristics of those who essentially out of the workforce are having health problems, you see these compounding impacts of the virus upon food security. Ultimately, we also see this interlink between food insecurity and access to nutritious, healthy food. With our collaboration with GAIN, the Swiss Agency of Development Cooperation, we see a clear link between food insecurity status and also the lack of a healthy diet. In a few countries, once again, we're seeing that gender gap emerge. Ultimately, a number of these key factors behind the policy interventions which are being used to tackle the pandemic are inhibiting essentially women's empowerment. We see a very, very clear gradient in terms of empowerment and food security. So that's another key warning sign that we need to watch. And then finally, there's a pandemic which we haven't actually discussed at all. So I know Lawrence mentioned malnutrition, but ultimately, global food insecurity is contributing towards a global mental health pandemic. The stress and worry of food insecurity is playing a catalytic role of exacerbating mental health crisis, which is very, very rapidly emerging.
And that's a whole new dimension that we haven't even begun to talk about. This pandemic is hitting us at a time of just immense global challenges, and we need to tackle all of these food security and nutrition and mental health dimensions of the crisis. This COVID-19 pandemic also raises the alarm on the urgent need to transform the world's food system. So, Mr. Rzepa, while I have you unmuted, maybe we need to start turning this away from describing the problem and start talking about maybe some of the things we might be able to do to mitigate risks and build back a resilient structure.
Wonderful. Thank you for the question, Laura. So first of all, I'd like to just pick up on the language you used there about building back better. As we've seen, the structures and the systems we had in place beforehand weren't necessarily putting us in the right direction. The trajectory of our ability to hit SDG 2 we were going very much the wrong way. And so first of all, I think we need to look at building forward better and understanding, okay, what are some of those systems that we need to put in place with using this opportunity of the Great Reset in order to do that. Some of the most dangerous words in the English language is, it's always been done this way. And so ultimately, let's use this as an opportunity to change that. As Martin mentioned, the difficulties are unprecedented from funding this. So ultimately, we're living in a situation where low and middle income countries, high income countries are all wrestling with unprecedented levels of debt. We've seen overseas development assistance levels looking to drop somewhere between 10 to 25 billion, declines in remittances between 20 to 28%, and foreign direct investment dropping 40%. Ultimately, there's a huge funding gap there, which will need to be addressed in order to address this. And so I'm a big believer that the answer actually lies within the SDGs. So SDG 17, this question around collaboration. Next year with the United Nations Food Systems Summit, it provides a brand new opportunity for us all to essentially approach the problem with a blank sheet of paper in order to think, okay, how can we redesign a food system which is actually fit for purpose and able to deliver this SDG 2.
Okay, thanks. And mentioning the UN food systems, maybe I'll punt this question over to you, Ms. Guarnieri. Do you have any thoughts from the UN point of view, particularly related to this UN Food Security or Food System Summit?
Well, thank you. And I really agree with Andrew that we really need to be redesigning a food system that is fit for purpose and fit for purpose for people and for planet, delivering for the most vulnerable and delivering both food security and healthy diets for all in a sustainable way. And that's the task in front of us. And the timing of the Secretary General's Food Systems Summit is really critical. So we need to come to that together. We need to bring to that summit an understanding of the risks and the vulnerabilities in our current food system, risks that are exposed by but not caused by the COVID pandemic. We need to use the opportunity to transform the power dynamics within the food systems so that they work for smallholder farmers, so that they work for women in order to deliver this healthy diet and food security for all. And we need to build into the process action that supports long-term resilience, and that's absolutely essential. So one key element that I think, and this picks up also on one of Andrew's points, is in that collaboration and in the partnerships, it's finding a way where benefiting and supporting the full engagement of smallholder farmers comes as a win-win also for the global and local private sector. So how do we really bridge those sectors together in a way that delivers food security and healthy diets for all? I think that's what we need to use the Food Systems Summit to do.
Thanks, and I guess that's a good segue back to Mr. Brown. You had an awful lot of very interesting comments about the smallholder farmer. So what's your perspective on all of this?
So thank you. Well, as I say, I'm probably biased, but I do think who produces the majority of the world's food, and so therefore, if we're thinking about food systems, we need to ensure we're remembering where so much of it is coming from, and and that's where I like to apply a lens of small scale producers. And we sort of know what the key risks are: climate change, disruption to markets, inputs, etc., food safety, access to information, and really the inherent vulnerability of poor small rural producers. So, and we know that the answer is about building resilience into the system, resilience into the farmers. We know a lot about how you build climate resilience, how you get access to digital services, etc., rural infrastructure, and so on. So, it's not a new agenda. I suppose, the question I have is really, so if we know what the issues are and we know what many of the solutions are, why is it not happening? Because nothing I've said or nothing out there is exceptionally new, but it isn't happening. And so I suppose I don't have any answers, but the sort of questions for me is, are we prepared to reduce climate risk by really investing in climate resilience of infrastructure, etc. We know it's a lot more expensive, but we continue to build infrastructure which is not climate resilient, and then we watch it 5 years down the road disappear again because we know it's a lot more expensive, but we're just not being able to convince people to invest that money. We're not doing things at scale, whether it's access to information, digital services. We've got many examples out there of how we can do it, but again, it's not happening at scale. And if we're serious about food systems and resilient food systems, then we really have to invest in these sort of things at scale to protect where most of the food is coming from. And equally, I suppose, we need to have the policy environments with government that help both the public and the private sector invest in these areas. So I really hope that the Food Systems Summit next year, goes beyond being a summit and actually must end up in action, because much of this we know what to do. We're just not getting the investments there, and we've all got a responsibility to convert fine words and lots of commitments, many government commitments, into real investment. And then I think we'll see change, and we can build resilient food systems and sustainable food systems. But we've never really seen the investment in agriculture and food systems that we all commit to actually becoming a reality. Thank you.
Mr. Van Wieko, what is your perspective on this, particularly some of these issues that have been raised about the climate smart agriculture and building those kinds of systems, funding available for that?
Yes, I think that is absolutely critical. I mean, because the challenges, of course, are huge. I mean, as the question kind of already implied. I mean, before COVID-19, I mean, the global food system was facing a challenge. I mean, to produce 56% more food by 2050 to feed 9.8 billion people, with business as usual that would require deforestation, area expansion of about 600 million hectares. I mean, twice the size of India. And with business as usual, I mean, it would actually increase greenhouse gas emissions from the sector from 12 gigatons to 15 gigatons, while the sector can only emit 4 gigatons, in line with the 2-degree world as per the Paris Agreement. So basically, also if you look at the hidden cost of the global food system prior to COVID-19, I mean, the 2 billion people undernourished, malnourished, 2 billion people overweight and obese, agriculture being the biggest driver of encroachment on natural habitats, biodiversity loss, 20+% of greenhouse gas emissions, 1/3 of agricultural production, food loss. If you put a kind of a cost, on those on all those dimensions of hidden costs, I mean, it adds up to about $12 trillion. It actually exceeds the market value of the global food system. So basically, of $10 trillion. So prior to COVID-19, I mean, the global food system was already subtracting rather than adding value. And clearly already then, I mean, it was clear that business as usual would be sufficient. Of course, now COVID-19 is setting us back even further. I think COVID-19 is also highlighting some of the vulnerabilities of the global food systems. I mean, the pandemic is of a zoonotic nature. I mean, those zoonotic risks increase with encroachments on natural habitats, and agriculture is one of the biggest driver. The whole relation between healthy diets, pre-existing conditions, COVID-19 morbidity, I mean, points in the direction of the need for more attention to healthy diets. And of course, the disruptions that we see in the supply chains, I mean, is a reflection of all the vulnerabilities and the concentration in those supply chains. What we see with COVID-19 is that those challenges will not go away, and actually that those vulnerabilities are being exposed. Now, we know what needs to be done. I mean, as Donald was saying also, I mean, the Growing Better report of FOLU that came out, I mean, lays out a clear agenda of 10 critical transitions, I mean, that the global food system needs to make, nature-based solutions being a very important part of it. But also, I mean, a change in diets. I mean, so it's not just the supply side, but also the demand side. The good news is if those critical conditions, dimensions, those critical transitions are being made, I mean, there's an economic dividend, I mean, to be captured of about $5.7 trillion by 2030, which of course further raises the question that Donald put forward. So if it's so attractive, why it's not happening? The cost, I mean, to make those critical transitions happen is about $300 to $350 billion per year between now and 2030, big number. So what needs to happen? Where will this money come from? Well, the answer is clear. As I said earlier, governments are providing almost $600 billion in public support to agriculture. Most of it is not very effective. And what I said earlier, the fact that this food system is subtracting rather than adding value is a clear indication that this public support is not very effective. So this needs to be repurposed. The European Union is moving in the right direction with the Green Deal. We need to decouple public support from production decisions and actually link it to incentives for farmers and the food system to provide better nutritional and environmental outcomes. I think the obstacles there our political economy. There's a lot of vested interest. And of course, it's also multi-sectoral agenda requiring interinstitutional coordination that currently doesn't exist. So I would say those would be two constraints that need to be overcome. If you want to repurpose public support in this direction and using government and public resources to provide incentives for farmers to invest in climate smart agriculture, we also need a very good governance framework. I mean, an accountability framework. So I think a missing piece of the puzzle there is a very good, low cost, almost real time monitoring risk and verification protocol. If you can come up with that, that would actually, what I said, this is a missing piece of the puzzle. Another entry point for leverage is, of course, the private sector that also puts up about, over $1 trillion in investments in the global food system every year. There are a lot of voluntary guidelines and principles for responsible agriculture investment that have been agreed a decade ago. I think it's now time to move on to binding, to look for binding business standards, and at the same time de-risking facilities, for the private sector to invest in green agriculture and green supply chains. I think the work that the World Benchmarking Alliance is doing will be very useful in this respect, and moving from the voluntary to the binding business standards. And then finally, with COVID-19, exposing or indicating or highlighting, the importance of healthy diets. I think there's also an important role for consumers to actually, and for governments actually to work with consumers actually to shift, the demand in the direction of healthy diets. We also know that the carbon footprint of healthy diets probably is lower than from the conventional diets. So that will then be a third kind of leverage point that will then trickle down in the supply chains, and I would expect the private sectors and farmers to respond to it, because ultimately that's the private sector. So a daunting agenda. I think the resources are available. We need to be smart on the leverage, and we need to tackle, those constraints: political economy, vested interest, accounting framework, and an MRV protocol. A kind of heads-on, to put the conditions in place, to go beyond business as usual. Thank you.
Thanks. And that definitely is a daunting agenda. There's a lot that you've named there that is certainly going to take some time and some energy and a lot of collaboration. Mr. Haddad, I wondered, given some of these higher level ideas for how to mitigate some of the risk, you were talking earlier about actually what you were seeing with the children. So I'm curious what you might think about some of the on the ground, closer to the community or household level ways of mitigating some of the risks and putting some resilience into the system.
Thanks, Laura. So food system transformation is going to take time. We don't have a lot of time. We need a list of really practical things that we can do right now. I think there are lots of really practical things, and some of the speakers have mentioned some of them. Let me talk about, very brief, I'm going to run through a few of them. Income collapse is one thing we have to address. Lots of governments have expanded their social protection programs, cash transfer programs, sometimes food transfer programs to the very poorest. My colleagues at the World Bank tell me that never have so many people been enrolled in social protection programs as they are today. Now, this is a fantastic opportunity to link these cash transfer programs to improved consumption of nutritious foods. So very often the income increases will be linked to foods that are not particularly rich in micronutrients. So there's a massive opportunity with existing resources to link big income boosts to nutritious foods. Nutrition programs per se, things like vitamin A supplementation, diarrhea treatments, breastfeeding promotion, complementary feeding programs. These are programs that have benefit cost ratios of 16:1. They completely outperform benefit cost ratios of roads and ports and that kind of heavy infrastructure. We need to keep those going. Now is the time to double down on high quality investments that have a long-term impact. And then finally, we need to keep food flowing. We need to keep nutritious food especially flowing. Governments can do so much. Governments can make sure that public procurement for schools and hospitals and the criminal system is geared towards more nutritious foods. We need to keep SMEs, small and medium enterprises, that are the backbone of food systems in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia and Southeast Asia. They don't have access to finance that bigger companies, and actually, ironically, smaller companies do. They're in this missing middle desert, this financial desert. They don't have the capacity. They have no working capital to keep going. They need loans that are below commercial rate. They'll pay them back, but they need them. Food system workers. If food system workers don't receive adequate food, they can't work, and our whole food system crumbles. We've seen that in high-income countries, the importance of food system workers as frontline essential workers. They are also frontline essential workers in lower middle-income countries. I'm really worried about food safety and keeping food markets open. So many food markets, especially fresh markets and wet markets, are closing down. The market in Addis had to close down recently because of food safety concerns and concerns around protocols around PPE for COVID-19. We need to pay a lot more attention to food safety. These are some of the short-term things we can do now. Food system transformation is going to require a number of really profound things. First of all, it's going to require, as some of the speakers have said, repurposing of government policies. There are so many policies that were developed in the 1980s and are geared towards alleviating hunger. That's still really, really important, but they need to be also focusing on the 3 billion people who can't afford healthy diets. 3 billion people can't afford healthy diets. So there are a whole range of government policies that can be repurposed. Investment in businesses and SMEs, whether it's big pension investors, big institutional investors, or even impact investors. 200 billion, the impact investment industry is worth 200 billion. 18 billion of that goes to Africa. 5 billion of that 18 billion goes to agriculture and food, and about 10% of that 5 billion goes to non-staple foods. That is just terrible. We need to change those incentives. And finally, consumer campaigns to convince consumers to purchase nutritious foods are just really feeble. They're very left-brain. They basically say you should eat more of this food because it's healthy and good for you. Well, as anyone with a teenager knows, that is not going to fly. The private sector is absolutely brilliant at getting us to buy things we don't need and don't even think we need until they told us we do. They use imagination, emotion, aspiration, fantasy. So we need a coherent blend of that. It's true to the science and faithful to the science, but it's much more creative. But below all of those big levers, what we need is to break through the public consciousness around the importance of healthy diets and our food systems. Our food systems are literally bankrupting our health systems. They are literally bankrupting our environment systems. They are literally bankrupting our livelihood systems. They're a silent killer and a silent destroyer, but the term food systems, it's too complicated, it's too technocratic. People like us love it, but it doesn't mean anything to the person on the street. Everyone's got a personal relationship with food. So we need something like Extinction Rebellion to sort of constructively generate and channel outrage to get government's attention, businesses' attention, and consumer attention. That's what we need to do. That's the most fundamental thing we need to do. Having 3 billion people unable to purchase a healthy diet is a violation of human rights. It's outrageous, and we need to puncture public consciousness to get that into the discussion in every schoolroom, around every dinner table, and in every cabinet meeting and every board meeting. Back to you, Laura.
Thanks. Very, very interesting comments and certainly very thought-provoking. We have only about 5 minutes left and we have 5 panelists. So how about a minute of closing remarks from each? Mr. Brown, may I start with you?
Thank you very much. So I suppose my sort of final remark is, that are we really serious about addressing this issue? I think, as Lawrence said, there is a crisis out there. COVID has only exacerbated and brought it more into focus. And the world has short memories. And if we don't actually take advantage of the focus at the moment that affects everyone, rich countries, poor countries, developing countries, developed countries. So while we've got this moment in history of everyone focused in it, and it's not just a poor country, developing country, poor person issue, we need to grip that. And I'm quite hopeful with the Food Systems Summit next year that we have that opportunity, but only if we can link that up to some of the other events next year. We have the G7, we have the G20, and of course we have COP26, which is so important. So, if there's real commitment and then money and action that follow it, I'm hopeful. And one has to be hopeful around issues like this. If not, I think the alternatives are too depressing to think about. Over.
Very true. Mr. Rzepa, any closing comments from you?
So I suppose, to quote Churchill, let's not let a good crisis go to waste. Ultimately, we are living in incredibly tough times, but at the same time, that raises a huge opportunity because people are starting to look at the health impacts of our diets, especially through the lens of the pandemic. And so let's leverage that opportunity to really drill down and focus on essentially what is the world eating. Let's try and ensure that ultimately we've got the metrics in place in order to understand that. And so we can help redesign these food systems in the wake of the summit next year to make it more fit for purpose.
Ms. Guarnieri, final comments from you?
I would simply say, right now things feel very uncertain out there in the world, and COVID has really destabilized and made many people feel very unclear and vulnerable when it comes to looking towards the future. When we're talking about hunger, it's very tangible. It's a problem we can solve. Food systems, they're our own creation. We can fix this issue. We can fix this problem. It requires political will. It requires resources. We know we have the tools and we know the solutions. So let's focus on something that we can solve.
Perfect. Mr. Haddad, any closing comments from you?
Yeah, I completely, the comments from my colleagues completely resonate. The Chinese symbol for crisis is a combination of symbols that say threat and opportunity. To mitigate the threat is hard work. It requires resolve and grit. I threw out the example of small and medium enterprises, get them more finance. That sounds like an easy thing to do, but it's not. They have to be ready. They have to be investor ready. So you've got to find them. You've got to make sure they're investor ready, and you've got to get the finance to them. That requires hard work, resolve, and grit. So to mitigate the threat is not easy. But we're in this mode right now where the unthinkable has become thinkable. The impossible has become possible. The undoable has become doable. And so we need to seize that opportunity. And as far as I can tell, the only constraint really is our own imagination and our own ambition. Back to you, Laura.
All right, thank you. And Mr. Van Rico, any final comments from you?
Yes, basically to kind of resonate to what my colleagues are saying. So, because I firmly believe that dealing with the impacts of COVID-19 will move us in the direction of starting to put in place those systemic changes that the food system need. I already see it happening. The economic impacts of COVID-19 is causing fiscal stress. So forcing ministers of finance to look at the effectiveness, of their public support programs. And of course, this is where agriculture support comes very much in the picture, because this is highly ineffective. I think everybody agrees, that the next pandemic needs to be avoided. So there's going to be huge interest in mainstreaming One Health systems, to avoid encroachment on natural habitats. I mean, and that will mean that sustainable intensification will need to be put front and center as a driver of future, I mean, productivity change. And I also think, I mean, that the quest and the demand for more resilience, I mean, that COVID-19 is causing, will move us towards, I mean, much faster than maybe imagined. I mean, embracing, I mean, the digital technologies, I mean, for better resilience, but it also bring all those other co-benefits of efficiency and other opportunities with us. So I think the impacts of COVID-19, if we are smart about it, will move us in the right direction.
And that's a very positive way to end a very interesting and robust discussion. Thank you to all of the panelists and to everyone who's been in attendance during this discussion. And with that, we'll end the session. Thank you. Have a good day.